Hello and welcome back to What Show History, the podcast that covers all areas of history, heritage and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Charlotte Golledge, who is a deaf historian, and she was driving me around Scotland, talking to me about graveyards, symbolism, death, everything to do with the darker side of history. Now, this was recorded as we were driving around, so there is a bit of a vibrational sound, but that aside, I do still hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Charlotte.
Hello, Kaylee.
Thank you for coming onto this podcast.
Thank you for driving around Scotland with me just now.
Yeah, so she's just been taking me on a little bit of a tour. We went to Dean Cemetery, and she was telling me all about the gravestones, the symbolism, and all that wonderful stuff. So, Charlotte, what is it about deaf history, cemeteries, Kirkyards, sorry, that fascinates you so much?
So I've always been interested in the more macabre side of things. Like when I was a child, I was never that interested in fairy tales, except the Three Billy Goats graph. I quite like that, but I was more interested in like this king that was chopping his wife's heads off. I mean, getting older, it's a bit disappointing when there's only two, but I've always liked the macabre. And growing up in Scotland, anyone who's visited a lowland Scottish graveyard, especially ones dating from the 17th, 18th centuries, will see we have a lot of symbolism inside our graveyards. There's lots of skull and crossbones. There's many symbols of mortality and immortality. So a child with an overactive imagination, they were always kind of fun places for me to go. I mean, fun isn't usually what most people associate with a graveyard, but for me, it always has been. And my mum, she actively quite encouraged it when I was a child. She liked things a little bit like that, where my dad found it all a bit morbid and weird. And that was kind of something that carried on to adulthood, where he would call me his morbid little creature. So yeah, it was greatly encouraged by one parent and completely dismissed by the other.
There's nothing wrong with that. We all have our weird things that we're interested in, but in regards to deaf history, I wouldn't say that's overly weird.
I don't think so. I mean, when I decided to do my master's degree, obviously it was on an aspect of social history, and I spoke to my tutor at the time, and I was like, well, I was thinking about doing something connected with Greyfriars. I mean, I'd already worked there for a long time already by that point. I mean, Greyfriars has had a long association with me. But I said to her, I was thinking of either something with Greyfriars or doing the workhouses. And she was like, please do not do the workhouses. I read a lot of dissertations on the workhouses, and it would be really interesting to see something that you have decided to do. So I basically took a gentleman called Thomas Smith. I got his funeral records from the National Archives of Scotland, and basically it went through the costings of his funeral, right down to how much his mural monument was going to be, what was needed for the funeral, right down to from the gloves for the mourners to wear to the watchmen who were going to have to watch over his grave to make sure body snatchers weren't going to come along and dig him up. So I found all that really, really fascinating. So basically my dissertation was the funeral of a 19th century gentleman buried in Edinborough. So that's not the exact title, I can't remember the exact title anymore, but it basically went through the whole process of the funeral. So my speciality kind of is 19th century funeral practices in Edinburgh. So
From more of a social standpoint rather than an archaeological one.
yes, from a social. So why we had the people that we had, what sort of rituals were carried out. I'm really interested in the process of how they got in there. I'm not so interested in once they're in there. So
That's fair. I mean, graves themselves are fascinating once you find out things, because from like an archaeological standpoint, because that's my background, we tend to look at graves and we paint a picture as to who that person was from the grave gods alone. But we also know that a grave or at least a grave of goods, doesn't necessarily represent the person that's gone into the grave. It's more representative of the person, the people surrounding them and how they perceive them. Is like gravestones the same sort of thing?
It's definitely the same thing, because it was deemed if you gave a loved one a poor funeral, that would actually come on you in social standing. People would actually shun you if you did not give someone a good funeral. I mean, especially the late 1700s, early 1800s, the actual committal part wasn't anything. You didn't have a minister there. There wasn't a big ceremony at the graveside. Everything was done leading up to that point. The famous walking funerals that we once had. And it was actually Charles Dickens who basically said he didn't understand why the living were paying so much for the dead when so many of the living needed help. And when you think of Oliver Twist, Oliver is sold to an undertaker who, he becomes a funeral mute walking at the front of the funeral. And at that time as well, Charles Dickens and people like him did not like undertakers very much, because it was seen that these people were benefiting from death. But then that's also when you had a lot of the life insurance companies were all setting up, so the poor in the community could emulate the aristocracy. They could have the same sort of fancy funerals on a smaller scale, but that was what was deemed that everybody wanted to have these fantastic funerals. And if you could afford a headstone as well, you wanted the headstone not only to represent the person who is passed, but kind of showing to people, oh, look what we've managed to put up. I mean, Thomas Smith, who I did my dissertation on, he was the first man to be buried in his grave. And I mean, it's a 25-person plot. And when it was built, the whole monument was put there, and it's a gigantic monument. But Thomas Smith's family had come originally, they were lower classes. His grandfather had been a gardener. His father had been a soldier at the Battle of Preston Pans on the side of the British, who gained a pension from the Crown. And basically, rather than have his children, living the same lifestyle, he actually paid for his son to go to sort of learn law. So Thomas Smith became a lawyer. He started buying and selling land, properties, and became very, very rich. And two of his sons actually married into aristocracy. So one son, John Smith Cunningham, he married Anne Dick of Prestonfield, who were the Cunninghams of Caprington, and basically he had enough money to buy out the landed upper classes of their title, and he basically bought their title. So from that point of view, when Thomas Smith died, John had this gigantic stone made for him to basically just show everybody else, look what we can afford. And so there's a lot of different facets from like looking at people's stones that you can get from who they are, what they believed. And at that point as well, we were moving away from symbolism. So it's the sheer size of it that kind of shows their social standing, even though it's quite plain to look at, because again, Charles Dickens sort of sticking his oar in there. People were seen, it was seen as being quite vulgar if you paid all this money for these highly decorative stones. But again, that came back in that we went all highly decorative again. But we didn't have so much in the way of mausoleums or catacombs and things, so it did sort of tone down a little bit.
I mean, Dickens has a point, in all fairness. But yeah, so when you took me through Dean Cemetery, there were some really beautiful things there. So if you ever get a chance to go there, I would definitely recommend. It's a very, very pretty cemetery. But you have the Celtic cross with the knotwork on it. There's a weeping woman in there. You were telling me as you were going through there about some of the different things that were becoming popular in that time as well because of the Reformation.
Yeah, after the Reformation, we cleared away anything that was, connected to Catholicism. So while down in England, basically Henry just wanted to have his cake and eat it, but he didn't actually want his religion to be played around with. The Anglican Church very much became Catholic in all but name, where he was the head of the church rather than the Prince of Rome, as he would call him. Where up in Scotland, it was deemed that nobody was above anybody else. You had God and then everybody was below that. And I mean, that's one of the reasons when James VI who had been brought up in this very strict Presbyterian childhood, and John Knox and George Buchanan were running around, and it was almost beaten out of him that royalty didn't mean anything. You were one of God's people, and you were no better than anyone else. So when Elizabeth I died and he became the King of England, he suddenly had the divine right of kings down there, which he enjoyed far much more than being beaten and told he was nobody when he was in Scotland. So that a lot of that came into play, and we did have with his son, and then later on down the line they tried to push the Episcopalian Church on the lowlands of Scotland. So there was a huge backlash to anything at all coming back that would be even remotely considered Catholic or from the Episcopalian Church. And in Scotland we didn't even celebrate Christmas as a religious holiday until the 1950s. It kind of been not more or less outlawed, but it had been outlawed at one time, but although it was still classed as the birth of Christ and everything else, it wasn't a holiday in Scotland. We had Hogmanay for our holiday, but then in the 1950s that soon changed and Christmas became a holiday once more. But a lot of that comes from the old days of when the Presbyterian Church was trying to ban anything that was even remotely fun. But then that's when you had your fashions coming in, so all of a sudden it was okay to have these Celtic knotwork crosses, especially if you could afford them. And somewhere like the Dean Cemetery, it was no longer connected to one religious body, where a lot of the kirkyards are in the lowlands especially are Presbyterian, so a lot of your gravestones are going to be quite sympathetic to the Presbyterian faith. Where when you get to a cemetery like Dean Cemetery, there is no denomination there, so people could start expressing themselves and expressing the fashions of the time more than having quite the religious sort of background behind them.
So you used another term. So I've got a book here that you have very kindly given me, which is the Graveyards and Cemeteries of Edinburgh. But you said that in your another book, as much as it's referred to as Greyfriars Graveyard, it's not actually a graveyard.
It's not a graveyard, no, it's a kirkyard. So in Scotland, it started off as a burial ground, and to start off with, you had your kirkyards which were connected to the kirk. There would be a kirk inside, but then some of these graveyards, these burial grounds, because they weren't cemeteries at that time. They weren't classed as cemeteries. They were burial grounds that were connected to a parish, so they were parish burial grounds. And basically, round about St Giles Cathedral was where Edinburgh's main graveyard or kirkyard was, because St Giles Cathedral, although it's called a cathedral, it's not a cathedral. It's the High Kirk of Scotland, and it just keeps its name from an earlier time, but it's not a cathedral. It doesn't have a bishop. There's nothing to do with that. It is the High Kirk of Scotland. But basically, the grounds round about it became so saturated with bodies, there was nowhere else to bury people. So Mary Queen of Scots gifted the lands of the former monastery of the Greyfriars to the people of Edinburgh for their burial. So it became a parish burial ground for St Giles. Later on, we get forward to 1620, and eventually a church is built inside the grounds there, and it does become Greyfriars Kirkyard. But obviously with my book, it's an English publisher. We obviously don't have kirkyards in England. We have churchyards, so a graveyard is kind of seen as being the more generic term that can be used. But if you visit Greyfriars today, you walk in and over the gate, you will see Greyfriars Kirkyard. And inside the book, I do call it a kirkyard as well. It's just, unfortunately, the publisher is the boss.
So I was going to ask about that as well. About what is the difference between the sort of graveyards and cemeteries in Scotland in comparison to England? Do you know?
So there's obviously various things. A lot of the Church of England is an Episcopalian church or Anglican church, depending on where you are. Scotland does have the Scottish Episcopalian Church, but like King Charles is not the head of the Scottish Episcopalian Church, where he is of the English one. So, we have differences there. Our cemeteries, newer cemeteries, it's harder to kind of say, because nowadays, like in Edinborough, we have cemeteries that have a high, an area where we have the Jewish quarters in the cemeteries, like at Piers Hill. You have like cemeteries that have large areas for the Muslim faith. And over time, a lot of these things have changed. But in Scotland, we don't have as many areas of where our dead can be buried. So I know there are areas like in England where you'll have a cemetery that is just mainly for the Muslim faith, or is mainly for another faith. So they have become, there is a religion behind them, although there might not be a religious building within the grounds. Where in Scotland, because of the limited places to bury people, everybody is kind of mixed in with each other a little bit. But you will find a lot of the old graveyards and kirkyards, they will pretty much be the denomination of that church, except some of the older ones where, when the Episcopalian faith was coming into Scotland, and although it's a Presbyterian churchyard, you will find that there are Episcopalians who are buried within the grounds. And when we kind of go up to the Highlands of Scotland, we do have Episcopalian churches, but you'll see a lot of them are a newer date. So after the rising of Culloden, the Episcopalian church was almost shunned in the Highlands, because it was seen that would be somewhere that potential Jacobites could congregate under the disguise of being at church, and they might try another uprising. So the Episcopalian churches did suffer quite a bit in the Highlands, although now you go up there and you will see a lot more Episcopalian churches, and they do have people buried within their grounds there.
So in regards to the cemeteries that are in Edinburgh, which is your favourite?
I mean, it has to be Greyfriars, because Greyfriars has been in my memory as far back as I can remember. I loved Greyfriars Bobby the film. I loved the book. My mum and I, when I was little, we would go through to Edinborough and we would try and find Greyfriars Bobby's statue, but my mum was very short and I was a little person, so we used to walk underneath the statue all the time. So no, the statue had never changed, it never moved anywhere, it's just we were too short to look at it. So it was fun later on in life, taking my mum and showing her the statue, which we had walked underneath countless times when I was a child. So yeah, and I mean, I have like my little historical family in there, Thomas Smith, and I do actually get to spend time at his 6 times great grandson's castle, Caprington, which the family had obviously hadn't taken, but had inherited through John Smith Cunningham. So I have an awful lot of affection for Greyfriars, and I had worked there for about 20 years in different capacities, both as a cemetery officer, but also I was the chair of the Friends of Greyfriars Kirkyard for a while. But there's even graveyards, there comes a time, unless you're buried in them, you need a bit of space from them. So I'm having my break from Greyfriars just now, but it will always hold a very, very, very special place in my heart.
It's definitely it's definitely a tourist attraction, but I feel it's a tourist attraction for the wrong reasons. So if anybody's gone to Edinburgh, you probably will go to Greyfriars for Harry Potter reasons, because apparently J.K. Rowling, or she who must not be named for many people out there, she got a load of names from there. What are your thoughts on that?
So some of the names that have been highlighted in more recent years, they don't correspond with things that she has said. In the early days when she was trying to gain notoriety, not notoriety, she's got that now, when she was trying to gain popularity, she would hint at maybe she had, maybe she hadn't. But then in more recent years, she's tried to say that no, she definitely didn't take the names from the gravestones. But, anybody who's watched Labyrinth will know that she has called, that hoggles called Hogwart at one point. So, you know, she's not beyond borrowing things from other places, I believe. And anybody from my age group who used to read The Worst Witch, I mean, that's basically Harry Potter. So, but yeah, she has said things. I mean, beyond a shadow of a doubt, McGonagall was definitely taken, I think, because it's quite a notable gravestone. You know, it's in quite a noticeable place. If you walked up to look at Harriet's, if you're having a walk, it's right next to Harriet's. I must say, Captain Thomas Riddell, I'm not entirely convinced, because Riddle is spelled Riddell in the graveyard, not Riddle. That's more like Riddle's Court, which is up on the Royal Mile. And Thomas is such a common name. So, and to be honest, where the gravestone is as well, it seems strange you'd have walked through a whole graveyard just to get an idea of one name that's in a far back corner somewhere. But that's just my opinion. You know, it's unless she actually says yes, she did. I mean, as I said, she's already said she hasn't, but then most people are disregarding a lot of what she has to say. So it's I think with a lot of popular culture, you know, people will believe what they want to believe, and even if the author turns around and says, no, that's not true, once they're invested in that belief, it'll take an awful lot for someone to change their opinion on things. I mean, once upon a time, Greyfriars Bobby and the stories of that, you know, that was quite unpopular, but Harry Potter has kind of integrated itself in the fabric and the tapestry that is Greyfriars, and whether people like it or not, Harry Potter is definitely there to stay.
So I'm assuming in regards to Greyfriars Bobby, you're on about the little doggy.
Yes, I am.
So yeah, if you go to Edinborough, there is a little statue of a dog. There is one just outside the pub. Is it the same one from the cemetery?
That's the original one. Yes, that is the one. There isn't. You have the gravestone inside the Kirkyard, but yeah, that's the original one that was commissioned by Baroness Coutts, who was the patron of the RSPCA, and it was apparently taken from the life of Bobby, but Bobby died before the statue was revealed. But when you look at it, it's got a bird bath, it's got a dog drinking part, and it used to have metal cups for humans to drink from as well. So it had its own little thing there. But there was the 1950s film of Greyfriars Bobby, if anyone's watched it. And I was luckily able to be in a very sort of strange ceremony a couple of years ago. The little dog who played Greyfriars Bobby, his cremated remains are actually now inside the church. And the reason for that being was the last man who owned the little dog that played Greyfriars Bobby, he lived near Lasswade. And when wee Bobby, as the little dog became known eventually anyway, when the wee dog died, he had the dog buried somewhere that he liked. So this is like a Hollywood movie star, a Disney Hollywood movie star, who was buried near Lasswade. And a few years ago, I think it was the great nephew of this gentleman, found out that they were going to be building on the land, and he contacted the landowner and basically said to her, do you know who's buried on your land? And a lot of research went into it, and they established where the little movie star Bobby's grave was. They found him, and he, without going too far point, he'd been wrapped up in plastic inside, so he was able to be cremated. And yes, you can actually go inside the church and you can go pay your respects to the little movie star Bobby, which technically I think is the most recent, not interment because he's not in the Kirkyard, you can't have him in the Kirkyard, but he's probably the most recent cremated remains to be within that area, and that's inside the amazing little museum that's inside Greyfriars Kirk.
That's kind of cute, though.
It's cute and bizarre, and it's just one of the many bizarre things that I have managed to be involved in my life. And I don't know how my mum would have felt about that one.
So, in regards to the graveyard itself, or Kirkyard, sorry, it's what famous ones are there, would you say? Or the ones that stick out to you?
Well, the ones that'll be the most acknowledged ones to most other people will, of course, be Sir George Mackenzie's tomb. This was man who is believed the Mackenzie poltergeist. And that's all centres around this one gentleman. But while most people will wrongly say that Mackenzie's tomb is the Black Mausoleum, it's not. The Black Mausoleum is in fact inside the Covenanters prison. And the Covenanters were a group of people who were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And this was at a time with your Presbyterians and Episcopalians, and at a time when the Presbyterians were being forced out of their faith. I mean, we've just been in Falkland, we've just been in a pub called the Covenanter, and that's after the Covenanters, who were they saw themselves as God's chosen people. They were kind of more Presbyterian than Presbyterian. And yeah, they were all quite happy to die for their beliefs. And in the Covenanters prison, that's where over 1,000 Covenanters were held after the Battle of Boswell Brig. And they were held there like pretty much until late November. And that was at a time when we didn't have global warming. So they were kept in this open area. There was no shelter, nothing else. And so George Mackenzie, he was one of the King's advocates, whose basic job was to ensure the law of the King was being upheld throughout the country. And his atrocities that's deemed against the Covenanters, not particularly those ones there, but the Covenanters in general, were deemed to be so bad that he should never be allowed to rest in peace. And actually his grave, his tomb, which you see it's a big domed shape mausoleum that's very much the Italian style. It's always said that noises would come from inside. The boys at Harriet's, they used to knock on the door and try and provoke Mackenzie to come out after them. And then in later years, we move forward into the early 2000s when a gentleman, well, I say gentleman, when a teenager by the name of Sonny Devlin, he broke into Mackenzie's tomb and basically removed the head of one of the skeletons inside and was caught playing football with it in the Kirkyard. So he was actually charged with breaking in and I mean he didn't get really that much of a punishment compared to what they would have done about 100 years before that, 200 years before that. But yeah, it was said that George Mackenzie would never be allowed to rest. However, what a lot of people don't realise is, yes, we have these atrocities on one side of the coin, but then on the other side of the coin, he was the man more or less responsible for stopping the witch trials in Scotland, because although he couldn't say anything directly against the monarch, he did basically say to people, how feasible is it that this said woman can turn into said animal and do these things? It's not reasonable to assume these things. It's not reasonable to believe in these things. So he was actually a solicitor who defended women who had been persecuted as witches.
He sounds like a really interesting person.
Incredibly interesting, very complex character. But of course, as we always say, history is written on the side of the victors. So, I believe he's had a much worse reputation than I think he actually deserves in certain aspects of his life. I mean, what he did it was at a time where your religion was the be all and end all. I mean, most Presbyterians believed that the harsher their life was on earth, the better it would be for them afterwards. So, people did a lot of things for religion that our modern conception would think was horrendous. But again, people also persecuted witches because they needed someone to blame for things. I mean, that hasn't really changed with time. We all want somebody to blame for something, and often quite wrongly emotions get involved in things. So we haven't really evolved that much.
No, we really haven't. That's the one sad truth about humans, unfortunately. But one other truth of humans is we all die. We all will eventually go in the ground one way or another, possibly.
We do, and that's the great thing about being a death historian, because my ultimate goal of my whole career will be dying. So, yay! I will succeed in my ultimate career goal one day. I just won't be able to tell anyone about it, but, how many people can say that at the very last point of their life, it's the end of their life's work?
So
I know, I can imagine me on the deathbed going, have I died yet? Oh, goodness sake, come on. Yes, I'm still here. So look, someone just smother me, it'll be fine. My humour is very dark as well.
I mean, you could always have like a really creepy letter similar to like the message in Monty Python where it goes, the castle of...
Yes, I think that's what it'll be. Definitely. I'll have that on my gravestone.
So Edinburgh is a very interesting place in regards to the sort of different cemeteries that they have. So you have your Kirkyards you've just mentioned, but there's also another cemetery that has a lot of interesting statues in it dedicated to very interesting people who are not from here.
Yes, we have Old Carlton Burial Ground, which again was a parish burial ground. So the people of Carlton Hill, their parish was down in Leith. And when they had to take their dead to be buried, they would have to trail all the way down to Leith to bury them. So the people eventually went to, I believe, Lord Balmerino and asked him if they could have a bit of land for themselves. So again, it's not a cemetery, it's a burial ground. But then we fast forward in time, and if anybody is visiting Old Carlton burial ground today, they will walk through the grounds and they will be looked down upon by Abraham Lincoln, as in the President Abraham Lincoln. And he is there standing over, there's a slave below him reaching up, giving thanks for the freedom. And as you look around it, there's a lot of symbology all on this stone. And basically the stone is there because there were 5 volunteers from Scotland who went out and fought in the American Civil War. Now, after the war, one of them, they all eventually died, and one of the widows basically decided to go to the American consulate and say, my husband fought for your country, I would quite like a pension. He's buried, his grave isn't even marked, after what he did, surely we can do something. So the American consulate thought, that's right, it's not good that these men fought for America and there's nothing there. So off he went back to America. He went and had a little chat with the likes of Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefellers, the Guggenheims, all these people, and they all put money towards a statue. I'm pretty sure that the widows would have preferred the money, but that's how we ended up with the statue of Abraham Lincoln. And it's the first place outside of America to have a permanent statue to Abraham Lincoln. But it does really surprise people when they walk in because, Scottish graveyard, that's not who you would expect to see at all. But interestingly, if you go into New Carlton, there is a gentleman buried there by the name of Robert Knox. And Robert Knox is of the same family of John Knox, but he wrote a poem called Mortality. And it turns out that Mortality was the very favourite poem of Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln would quote from this poem so often that people actually thought it was him, Mortality, when in fact it was this little man in Edinburgh instead. So it's kind of cool that these two very close burial grounds next to each other have a connection to Abraham Lincoln, as far-fetched as it possibly can be.
Well, that's the wonderful thing about coming to Scotland as a whole, really, because nearly every time I come on a tour, I'm always learning about these random people all around the world that you go, oh yeah, clearly they're from such and such a place, and they go, nope, they're from Scotland, or they have influence from Scotland and stuff, and it's like, I think that in itself is actually really, really cool.
I mean, a lot of people, doing my job, we do have a lot of people who come from Pittsburgh, and they're very shocked to find out that Andrew Carnegie was actually born in Dunfermline. He's known as the world's richest man, this Pittsburgh multi-millionaire, where actually he was from a small weaving family in Dunfermline. And then when most people are sitting there looking up on their mobile phones trying to catch me out with things, you're just like, yeah, you do know it was a Scottish man that invented not a mobile phone, invented the telephone, not the mobile phone. But it kind of, there's all these little things that start off and you find out, oh yeah, that came from Scotland, or they were originally from Scotland, or But I think it's just because it's cold and damp and dark in the winter, so we've got nothing else to do. So we just invent things.
Not wrong with that. So when you took me through Dean Cemetery, you said there was certain people in there that had created things as well, and there was a lady you mentioned who did a bust.
Yeah, so that's Amelia Patton. And Amelia Patton was the wife of David Octavius Hill. So if you look up any antique pictures, photographs of Greyfriars, or a lot of things in Edinburgh, it was David Octavius Hill was the photographer who did that. And Amelia Patton was from a family of artists in their own right. Joseph Patton was asked to join the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but he didn't want to. But Amelia actually is one of the very few women whose art at that time was considered to be, quite special, and her skills as a sculptor, never mind as a woman, but as a sculptor, were celebrated. And you've got the Scott Monument, which is the giant medieval looking spaceship that's in the middle of Princes Street Gardens. She actually sculpted some of the statues on that, but she did a bust of her husband, David Octavius Hill, which if you go into Dean Cemetery, it's quite a fantastic bust. It looks quite Grecian, like all these sort of things do look quite Grecian. But it's the fact that her work again is on permanent display from this leading, artistic family, from a time when women were not really considered to be that important. She was an important artist in her own right, as well as her family connections and as well as who she was married to.
Yeah, so overall, deaf history is a fascinating thing, I suppose. Like you've just mentioned just a few different stories of from gravestones alone. Mm-hmm. Is this one of the things why you liked to do it, because it's telling stories of just everyday folk?
I love that. And I mean, when I was a cemetery officer, one of the things I would like to do, and people laugh at me about this, like some people play Sukudo, some people do crosswords. I like to pick a gravestone and then go home and research that person. No other reason other than I just enjoy researching. And I also like the idea that somebody was loved so much or respected. We won't always say loved, but maybe respected, or maybe they weren't at all, they just had the money to have their name there. But there was enough feeling for someone to be forever memorialized on a piece of stone. So I think it's all of our jobs really to read the names, because we bring that person back, even if it's just for a little while. People wanted to be remembered. We all want to be remembered in one way or another. And by reading the gravestones and finding out about the people, it's bringing them back just for a little while. We didn't have to meet them. But I mean, I find it fascinating if I'm in a graveyard, like I said to you when we were in Dean Cemetery, if all of these ghosts if there was such a thing as ghosts and they all came alive, half those people would know each other. They knew each other in life, and I find it fascinating that they're all together in this community in death. Which nowadays, most people, you go to a large cemetery and nobody will know anybody else around them. You might know the odd person, there might be a connection somewhere, but these old ones, everybody knew everybody because people didn't really move around much. Again, it's like we're talking about ancestry and family. It's like you go back hundreds of years and your family have never really moved because they didn't really move back then. It's only in more modern times that, you can have grandparents buried in one county, parents buried in another county, children buried in another country. I find all that fascinating, and I think being lucky enough to be interested in a time and period where people were still together. And I mean, now that we have, burial will not be a thing forever, that we're running out of space, and more people will be cremated. I mean, at one time to be cremated would be like, people would even be able to comprehend the idea of cremating somebody, where now nearly every funeral you go to, I think we find it stranger if we're at a committal than we are at a crematorium. So we are going to lose these things, and one day our gravestones will all be so uniformed and all the individuality will disappear, which is a shame, but I'm not going to be around to see that, so it's okay.
Yeah, And in regards to cremations as well, it's just like the further back you go in regards to cremations, because people did do cremations in the Iron Age, the Roman era and stuff like that, but they didn't go to the same level of heat as we do today. So that even then, even if it's an urn, there is still some parts of their remains behind, so you can learn about like what sex they were, what illnesses they may have had, maybe they're standing in life from the stuff that does remain. Whereas when we go, we are literally just ash.
Well, this is a funny bit. So working as a cemetery officer, my job, my office was the local crematorium. We don't really come out as ash. We go through a coffee grinder as well. So
Oh, lovely.
yes, so you don't come out all like a big pile of dust. No, you pretty much come out. You can be raked through. There's still discernible parts, and yes, you go into what generally is just a big giant coffee grinder to grind you down the last little bit. And the interesting thing is about crematoriums and the cremation process is the same amount of time is generally used for everybody, whether it's a large person, a small person, a child. It's the same amount of time, and you kind of go in and the heat is so high, it's not like you got a bigger turkey so it's got to go in for longer. It's pretty much the same amount of time. And many years ago, I was going up to the crematorium for a meeting with the then boss. It's not the boss who's there now. There's been a few bosses in between. I'm not even going to mention who they are. And I went up to a meeting there about Greyfriars, and I'd asked the question, how do you know when it's done? I thought it was like a microwave. It went ping, and he showed me like this little peephole and went, look through there. And of course I just looked without even thinking, and there was this glowing red skeleton in front of me through this peephole, which really kind of I'm not gonna lie, it gave me nightmares for a little while afterwards, because in my head, yes, you went in the oven and it went ping, and then there was like a nice little pile of ash, like Hansel and Gretel and the witch. That was what happened. I didn't actually realize the process. So having my history degree, having the jobs that I've gone into, has led me to learn new things that I never thought I'd ever learn about, which can be a bit awkward when I'm sitting there at a funeral and I'm sitting thinking, I know what's happening to the people in the funeral beforehand. I know what's going on below us. I know what's going on here. So yeah,
It's sad for the person.
yes, yes. I can't help that now. I'm off down in my imaginary land of things again. But yes, it's definitely an interesting process. But if it came out, even though it's water, if people came out the way they did, obviously. We have a lot of our cairns where they find the cremated remains, and as you said, there's so much you can find out. Yeah, if we were just taken out of those ovens and just shoved in it, you wouldn't fit in a jar. Let's put it that way. There'd be a little bit of a jigsaw left. So.
Fair. Well, thank you for taking us down this very morbid road. Is there anything else you feel like people need to know about this field? Because there is a lot of people who are interested in graveyards as a whole for a variety of different reasons. What would you say to somebody who's maybe wanting to go down this route themselves?
I mean, I pretty much started the route myself just by being interested in Greyfriars, and it actually started off with me finding the gravestones fascinating, but also seeing how they were decaying. And the gravestones that we have, they're soft sandstone, the amount of pollutants we've got in the air now. So I would say one of the first things you really want to do is get a pet graveyard, start documenting the stones there, not just what's written on them, but what they look like, because these could be an invaluable tool for generations further down the line. Things might disappear, they might go. I mean, obviously all the most important and the most well-known graveyards, they're always going to be documented. There's going to be multiple things on them, but the smaller ones, little family ones, little ones in the woods and stuff, those are the ones that really need to be documented. And I mean, I would have to say, having a job like a death historian means, if you're really good at something that no one else is really good at, then it does set you apart from everybody else. I'm just going to apologise for driving over 18th century cobbles right now. So. But yeah, I would say, find a graveyard, start documenting the people, take an interest in the lives of the people that are once there. Because, as I said, we all want to be remembered, and there will come a day that will be gone, will be forgotten, and I think as humans we find that quite a hard thing to kind of comprehend, that one day we're going to be gone and people might not actually care about us. So there always needs to be someone out there to care for the dead.
That's really lovely. Brilliant. Thank you so much for this, Charlotte. It's been a pleasure to learn more about this stuff. And thank you for this tour that you took me on as well. It was really lovely.
You are more than welcome.
So we were very, very lucky when we went round Dean Cemetery today. It was blue skies, nice colour foliage and everything like that. Lovely.
Yeah, it's not the gloomy graveyard that people expect.
So thank you so much for this, and it's been lovely to meet you and chat with you.
You're welcome. We'll probably chat again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.